As a truck driver starts his shift, he turns on the radio. The news reports record profits for corporations and a booming stock market. His pay, however, is struggling to keep up with rising prices. Does this story sound familiar? It very well could, because as you can see here, in the last decades median wages have remained relatively stagnant, while stock prices have experienced tremendous growth. Some people think rising stock markets are just a sign that the economy will do better in the future, perhaps thanks to AI. Others think that it's because rich people are getting richer and therefore are buying more assets, driving up the price of assets. But in the US, populist politicians on the left and right are increasingly blaming giant monopolies like Amazon and the other usual tech suspects. According to Bernie Sanders,
where in sector after sector, you have a handful of large corporations controlling what goes on and engaging in a lot of price fixing.
This is not just a moral issue, it's
bad economics.
But is that true? Doesn't economics tell us precisely the opposite, that efficient, innovative companies like Amazon, Microsoft and Nvidia should be rewarded for their innovation, while inefficient firms obviously shrink and then disappear? To find out, besides my usual deep dive into the scientific literature, I reached out to an expert on market power, Professor Jan Eekhout, author of this book, The Profit Paradox, who told me that
we see that what we call market power dominance of large firms has increased, and this has enormous implications for the entire economy.
Luckily, he also argues that it really does not have to be this way, because
we have very good policies to make these natural monopolies competitive. And the type of policies that make it competitive are the type of policies like in sports, where you have to have a referee, where you have to have a set of clear rules, and these rules are leading to more competition. They're kind of pro-competitive.
But before diving into whether or not giant monopolies are bad and how we can fix our economies, we first need some context. That is, how did we get here? How did giant corporations come to dominate our economies? To answer this question, we need to go back to the 1980s. In the early 1980s, profits per product, what economists call markups, were actually lower than they ever were before. Meanwhile, stock prices, adjusted for inflation, were also at an all-time low. But then something strange happened. Not only did both markups and stock markets return to their previous peak, they went into the stratosphere. But why? What happened in 1980 that made big companies so much bigger and especially so much more profitable? My research led me to two key events that made companies more profitable and two separate key events that made companies bigger and bigger, but not necessarily more profitable. This distinction is crucial because, as we will see, massively increased profits for the biggest firms may be a problem for the economy. But big giant firms in general, this may actually be a good thing in some cases. To see why, let's discuss the first key event that made companies naturally bigger: the mass adoption of
digital technology. 1980 is really a point in which households, firms, society as a whole starts to use computers. In the 90s, it's the World Wide Web that comes in action and has an economic impact. The 2000s, it's probably all mobile technology, mobile phones. 2010, it's probably big data. 20s, it's probably going to be artificial intelligence. Period. It's not just this one thing, press a button and this is digital technology. This is an evolution.
Crucially about this evolution, digital technologies have what economists call economies of scale. That is, the more products you make, the less they cost you to make them. One of the most important reasons for this is the presence of so-called fixed costs. To understand why, consider the airline industry. To produce an airplane, you obviously need to pay your materials and man-hours. And because these costs come back for each plane that you produce, economists call these costs variable costs. However, before you can produce your first airplane, you need to do years of research, testing, and you need to build an entire factory. These costs are called fixed costs because it doesn't matter how many planes that you make, you always have them. They are fixed. So if you only build one plane, essentially you need to make back the variable costs plus all fixed costs when you sell that single plane. If you make 2 planes, the variable costs remain per plane, but you can spread the fixed costs over 2 planes. So the more planes you make, the more you can spread the fixed costs, until eventually each plane costs you almost as much as the variable costs. Now compare this to a handcraft furniture workshop. Each piece of furniture requires skilled labor from start to finish, cutting, assembling and finishing. Therefore, variable costs are high. Meanwhile, fixed costs like the cost of tools and potentially a room to work in are relatively low. Therefore, a craftsman only needs to make a few chairs to make back the costs of his tools. And because of these lower fixed costs, it's far easier to enter the market for handcrafted furniture than to enter the aircraft industry. High fixed costs act as what economists call a barrier to entry into any market. Therefore, as a rule, industries with high fixed costs tend to have fewer competitors. This is why just after the Second World War, you only had a couple of plane makers per country, like, for example, Boeing and Douglas in the US, Fokker in the Netherlands, Sud Aviation in France, and de Havilland in the UK. While each of these countries had hundreds, if not thousands, of artisanal furniture workshops. However, today, like more and more industries, the global airliner industry is dominated by giant monopolies. 2 in this case, Boeing and Airbus. So, what changed? This gets us back to Prof. Eekhout's point about the innovation of digital technologies since the 1980s. Essentially, his point is that for each wave of innovation, computers, better communications, the internet, big data, they all increased economies of scale by raising fixed costs. These technologies allowed Boeing, but also companies like Amazon or Zara, to conduct research and testing more efficiently and to coordinate ever larger global supply chains. As a result of the digital revolution, fixed costs, therefore, becoming less in total, became a larger share of the total costs. Therefore, all affected markets became more concentrated and dominated by fewer larger players. This dynamic was then supercharged for the new industries created by the digital age, like computer operating systems and social networks, because for each of these products, the variable cost of selling to another user is virtually zero, meaning that naturally these new industries are dominated by giant companies. But technological change is not all that happened in the 1980s. This IMF graph shows us that 1980 was also the starting point of hyper-globalization.
We now have a global economy that a lot of the activity or markets in which you are operating are basically the whole world.
So while previously an airliner could only get so big because there was only so much national demand, globalization means that to remain competitive, companies really had to get bigger and bigger. These 2 events, the adoption of digital technology and globalization, are the 2 key things that happened in 1980 that can explain why firms have become bigger. But they don't fully explain why these giants have also become so much more profitable. After all, in a so-called free market, if big companies earn massive profits, then, of course, competitors will soon come in and try to take some of these profits for themselves, which will drive the price down. Yes, higher fixed costs may mean that it's more difficult to get into the airplane manufacturing business than in the furniture workshop business, but as famous US economist Alan Greenspan pointed out in the 60s, US financial markets are so large that in theory, any truly unfair monopoly should be impossible to sustain because competitors will come in. And yet, this is not what we have seen today. Not only have firms gotten much bigger, their profits have gone up like crazy and stock market valuations of the biggest companies have of course followed suit. But surprisingly, these record profits, the number of startups challenging them, has relentlessly gone down, not up, as Greenspan implicitly predicted. So, what happened? Why did the story of big firm competition fail? Essentially, I found 3 reasons in Eekhout's book. But before getting into these, let's first discuss how you can demonopolize your own digital products thanks to the sponsor of our video, Proton, the first privacy-first alternative to big tech services like password managers and cloud storage. Specifically with Proton Pass, you can finally take back control of your logins. It securely manages all of your passwords and even creates anonymous email aliases, so you're not forced to hand over your identity to a big tech firm every time that you sign up for a new service, for example. And with Proton Drive, you don't have to rely on cloud storage that spies on you. Every document, every photo, every note is encrypted end-to-end, meaning you can access them, but nobody else can, not even Proton. You see, Proton was created by scientists at CERN. It's based in Switzerland under strong privacy laws and it's community funded. That means their only loyalty is to you, not to advertisers or shareholders. So if you're ready to escape the grip of big tech monopolies, click the link in the description, get an amazing discount and join the millions of people worldwide who've already made the switch to Proton. So yes, clearly there are firms challenging the latest dominant monopolies, but they are fighting an uphill battle for at least 3 reasons. The first reason is that the digital economy brought a new
source of these scale economies, which is what we call network externalities. I mean, I like a social network because everyone's on that social network. That's where the value is coming from. And again, there's no point in having 2 equal social networks.
Think about it, if all your friends are on a platform like Instagram, Tinder or Facebook, then it only makes sense to switch to a new platform if all your friends do it at the same time. This dynamic makes it incredibly hard for new competitors to break in, meaning that existing firms can essentially charge higher prices, or in the case of social networks, sell your data to advertisers rather than keeping it private. The second reason why competition has failed is that when competitors do emerge, dominant firms can often buy them out. Facebook bought Instagram, Match Group bought Tinder and later Hinge. These mergers let monopolies neutralize threats and entrench their dominance. This trend is not limited to tech. For example, in the pharmaceutical industry, research shows that acquired drug projects often disappear if they overlap with the buyer's existing products. Monopolies can say that these acquisitions are for synergies, and sometimes that's true, but let's be honest, it's also often about killing the competition. This is great for investors. Just listen to how legendary investor Warren Buffett describes his perfect investment.
I don't want a business that's easy for competitors. So I want a business with a moat around it. I want a very valuable castle in the middle. And then I want the duke who's in charge of that castle to be honest and hardworking and able. And then I want a big moat around the castle.
The reason, of course, is simple. When a company operates like a monopoly with a big moat around it, it can basically charge the price that it wants, which generates extraordinary profits for the firm. Of course, this anti-competitive behavior goes against the interest of consumers. So, to keep markets competitive, we had very strict antitrust laws in the 1950s, 60s and early 70s. But in the following decades, economists like Greenspan successfully argued that markets were always self-correcting and that if bigger companies were more profitable, this was purely because they were more efficient. This brings us to our final reason why firms got way more profitable after the 1980s, which is the loosening of antitrust laws, which led to far less court cases brought against companies who practiced anti-competitive behavior or bought up the competition. This means that we can now answer our question about what happened in 1980. It were 5 things. First, digital technologies and globalization, number 2, made companies bigger and bigger by increasing economies of scale. Then the increased prevalence of network effects, number 3, and increased anti-competitive behavior, number 4, enabled by looser antitrust laws, number 5, can explain why big firms have become so much more profitable and why stock markets have done far better than wages. This clearly sounds like a bad thing. But is it really? Sure, perhaps giant monopolies do engage in anti-competitive practices. But it's hard to deny that companies like Google, Microsoft and Nvidia are some of the most innovative companies in the world. So, are giant monopolies actually making our economies worse? Prof van Eekhout's answer is yes. In his book, he mentions 4 main ways that monopolies are making our economies worse. The first is that monopolies charge higher prices for consumers. This is bad in itself, but it also creates a second bad effect, which is that higher prices mean less demand. Less demand means less production, and less production then means monopolists hire fewer workers than firms would in a competitive market. When this pattern repeats across sectors, total demand for all workers will fall, and with it, worker bargaining power, meaning workers have to accept lower wages. This can explain that while productivity used to lift wages, So when firms became more efficient, workers earned more. Now, since the 1980s, that link has largely been broken, and wages for typical workers have essentially stagnated. But of course, not all wages have stagnated. This brings us to the third way monopolies are making our economies worse, which is increased wage inequality. Simply put, as dominant firms expand, they compete aggressively for top performers. For example, since a marginally better strategy or a few lines of superior code can be worth millions of monopoly profits later on, big tech monopolies like Facebook or X are now paying millions to superstar AI engineers. The same effect also helps explain why CEO pay has exploded since the 1980s. Higher prices, lower overall wages, increased inequality, this all makes intuitive sense. The fourth way monopolies are making the economy worse, though, which is about innovation, makes less sense.
It may sound counterintuitive, but these dominant firms, of course, they invest a lot in innovation. But if I would take, 100 small firms that are as big as one large firm, these 100 small startups jointly innovate more than this one large firms. And this is something that we see, that the innovation is actually declining in firm size.
So, to sum it all up, in this book, Eickhout tells us that the latest research indicates monopolies not only mean higher prices for consumers, it also means lower median wages, higher wage inequality, and finally, less innovation. That's not great. So essentially, the question then becomes, what can we do to fix our economies? According to Eickhout, the answer may be found in sports.
The way we organize sports is we make sure that there's a level playing field, that there's even financial constraints on how strong you can become, especially in the US sports. Like in sports, where you have to have a referee, where you have to have a set of clear rules, and these rules are leading to more competition. They're kind of pro-competitive.
In theory, this is not that difficult. It means simply going back to some of the antitrust regulations that kept monopolies in check during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Of course, technological advances means we can't do things exactly the same way as back then. Therefore, Prof. Eickhout also suggests in his book that we encourage a concept called interoperability. Interoperability means separating the entity that manages the network from the operators of that network. For example,
if you try to send a message from WhatsApp to Telegram, that's impossible. There's no interoperability in messaging. Why? Because if you're WhatsApp, you don't like interoperability.
But what if we force WhatsApp to separate the network from the operation? The network are our contacts. The operation is the messaging app itself, the emoticons, the privacy features, and so forth. Forcing companies to accept each other's messages could give messaging challengers, like Signal and Telegram, a fair shot, and encourage WhatsApp to make its service better. That is the magic of competition. There's some pretty compelling evidence that this really works. For example, in Europe,
they've made the high-speed rail interoperable. This is now legislation that's coming from the European Commission that says, I have a train line between Paris and Lyon. And now the Spanish company can go on a train line. What is the network? The network is the line. There's only one. If it was run by SNCF, the French company, it's a monopoly. They own the line. They say no one else can come on it. But now the new legislation says, no, if a Spanish company, a Dutch company, an Italian company, a German company wants to compete on it, which they do today, and they can, under certain conditions, so they have to pay a usage fee. They have to pay for the cost of using that rail line that's set by this European Commission regulator. If they have that pay that usage fee, they can decide how much to sell a ticket for. They can decide when at what time to put a train. And so basically it becomes now competitive the way that really airlines are competitive in Europe. They weren't 20 years ago when you had the national airlines.
And recent research shows that this policy has benefited European travelers by lowering ticket prices, and with ticket prices decreasing around 28% after 9 months of competition. Cheaper fares then mean more people can afford to travel, which in turn boosts demand and encourages operators to hire more staff. So perhaps some of the many problems that we frequently talk about on this channel, like inequality, rising prices, and economic stagnation, are actually also a result of decreased competition. Of course, the world is not so simple that one explanation can explain everything. There are likely also other things at play. But still, I thought that this competition angle was particularly interesting because it may be politically less challenging than just taxing people more. But yeah, that is my take. What do you think? Can we make markets competitive again, or is that a naive pipe dream given that big business tycoons are increasingly influencing politics? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to demonopolize your tech, don't forget to check out our sponsor Proton via the link in the description of this video, where I also provide a regular and affiliate link to this amazing book.